They arrive. Jeff's eyes were still open. What they said about dead bodies was true. He'd frozen into place the night he was murdered by the man in the mask, then been left to rot. Lee, chained to the cot directly across from him, would have used her jacket to throw it over him, but it was held hostage by her wrist restraints.
He deserves some goddamn dignity.
She spent her time trying to focus on the few enjoyable nights she'd shared with him in the tent, rather than the gut-wrenching, almost incomprehensible evil she was forced to relive every instance she caught an accidental glance. A freight train of guilt was running her down, screaming, "This is all your fault," inside her head.
They tried to warn me. Everyone.
Yet she'd never hesitated to open the door for even a second.
Some things aren't meant to be found. Lesson learned. Can I go now?
For the first time in her life, Lee was as alone as she'd long wished to be, and felt nothing but shame for it. The utter isolation was overwhelming and impairing. There were no friends near, no allies. The closest family she had were in Zimbabwe, 2,400 miles southeast.
Couple of aunts and a pair of grandparents, none of which I've ever met. Mom told me Grandpa was a mayor. Might still be, not sure. She never revealed the name of the town she came from, but said it was near a mine. Gramps and I didn't keep in touch after Mom died, and he never tried beforehand.
The skin on her wrist was getting better, which was the only good news. It had been torn up fighting her chains on the first day of entrapment. The second day she'd decided to let it heal so she could try again today, the third. Though at the moment she was too tired to even make the effort, as her captor had not given her much to eat or drink, and what little he had made her wretch. The man in the mask seemed only interested in the temple, reappearing randomly, occasionally bringing something for her. Once, it was a dead rat covered in maggots. When she refused, thinking it was an insult, Lee swore he was the one offended. Another visit, he brought a half-empty can of pickled yams that had clearly been sitting in the sun without a lid for a week. "Eat," he said in his fingernails on the chalkboard voice. Taking the jar graciously, ignoring the flies buzzing around it, Lee promised to eat it later. The masked man seemed satisfied enough that day and left. However, in some visits he would take a seat on the cot nearest Lee, oblivious to Jeff's remains, and ask her questions. His curiosity about the temple matched her own. Even though he knew a great deal more about it and its original inhabitants than she did, he also appeared in the dark as to its true origins, implying several times an ancient people called the Raythians had once used it as a place of worship, but were not its original creators. "All had forgotten it," he once said, then added with disdain, "Even the great Michael and his brother Avail knew not of it." The second day, Lee felt confident enough to ask him his name. The masked man responded, "This union is called Joseph." Wanting to test her luck, she pressed him further on his origins. "The demon has lived many thousands of years in the fire. Always there. Always serving. Always groveling." Joseph cleared his disgusting throat before continuing. "The demon stayed low. The demon found the shadow in which to hide. The demon waited. The demon listened. So long. Like Gehenna, the demon was forgotten and became the nameless. The demon was the only one to discover the truth, which you have made reality." The words were still haunting her a day later. Lee couldn't be sure if the man was simply a psychopath whose body was failing him, or if he was telling the truth. Intelligent in a fashion, Joseph was able to run riddles around everything she threw at him, and was not to be underestimated. The strength alone it would have taken to rip Jeff asunder was enough to make her extra careful.
One wrong move. I can usually talk my way out of shit, but this isn't exactly a contract negotiation.
Presently, Joseph's boots crunched their way up to the tent on approach. The flap was pulled aside, and his monstrous frame curled through the entryway, carrying a rusted steel bucket with liquid sloshing around inside.
Hope to mom's god it's drinkable.
Lee waited for him to make the first move, but Joseph stood still at the entrance, not quite looking at her. His neck then suddenly jolted straight, and he started forward. Lee felt her spine tighten and legs contract inward as he came upon her, setting the bucket down at her feet, splashing what looked like water over her shoes. It was foggy, but more promising than anything she'd gotten so far. "Drink," he said with a low, gravelly tone, as though fatigued. Lee forced a quick smile. "I will. Thank you." Sitting on the cot opposite her, shoving Jeff farther to the side, Joseph slumped down, leaned on his knees, and drew sandpaper breaths for an uncomfortably long moment, sounding as though any might be his last. The dark slits in the plain white mask stayed fixed on her. "I hope I'm not being presumptuous, but I need food too," Lee said flatly.
"Food can wait. Our human has grown to know the absence of it. You will too."
"Is your plan to let me freeze to death then?" she asked.
"Death does not call unless it wishes to,"
Joseph said. "Then what's your plan?"
"No plan."
"Okay. What do you want?" she asked.
"Nothing."
Joseph reached into his coat and revealed the smallest Gehenna stone.
Oh, what now?
He caressed it like a rabbit in his hand.
"Do you know what it is?"
"It's a rock. World's full of 'em," Lee said banally.
"It is Melu. Its brothers are Raid and Ailam."
"Of course. And the temple is magical, and inside is a genie who can make all your dreams come true. I support you. I'm just not in the business of believing that sort of thing. See, I dig up the graves of people who did a long time ago. Not so smart, those people, you ask me." Joseph cackled, hawking saliva into his mask.
"The demon has walked the earth many times, over many years, and sees nothing special in the humans of today versus those of yesteryear. Except for those on their way here, those who choose."
I see. So you're a believer of some kind? Is that why you do the things you do? You feel its divine purpose?
"The divine is to find your purpose."
Wonderful. What's yours? Lee asked.
"We have kept that secret for millennia. We will not share it so easily,"
Joseph said. I know mine doesn't involve this tent or these chains.
"On this we agree."
He pocketed the stone, stood, and leaned toward her, gripping her chains and ripping them free.
"Come."
He walked to the tent entrance. There was no room for an escape. Standing for the first time in days, Lee taught her legs to work again and left the tent with Joseph, traveling down the hill to the campsite. Moving through the rows of abandoned tents, they started up the hill where the path toward the cavern and the dark cathedral lay, eventually reaching the crest. There, Joseph broke away to forge a new path, hiking eastward over rough terrain filled with cracks and cacti until they came to a cliff edge. Below them, The desert valley stretched on, its rolling hills and mountains covering the horizon. Late into the afternoon, a haze rolled in, paving the way for dusk. Joseph stood tall above it, taking a satisfied breath.
They are here.
Who? Asked Lee, hoping the answer wasn't any more Joseph's.
The believers,
He said.
so far they do not disappoint.
There are people who follow you? Lee asked, sadly believing it already. Makes sense. I know a cult leader when I see one.
No, the Raythians do not follow. We simply promised them something. The ever-present dream of all who worship Wrath. They believe our union will ascend, dethrone the Fallen One, and rule on high in Eros.
Joseph's tone was becoming increasingly self-indulgent.
The Third Lord, bringing the Great War in Furious once again.
Felt a little rehearsed.
And this is something they want? Lee asked with continued banality.
Enough to choose to believe it.
Sounds like blind faith to me.
There is no other kind. The universe will never reveal itself to the living, or the dead, nor to any form of being. There is no purpose. None have found it. Life will always traipse aimlessly, lost in the light. God will never reveal itself. Mark our words.
I don't know what you're talking about, but you sound like every other narcissistic asshole in history, Lee said. Sargon of Akkad was a dick like you. The first emperor, ever hear of him? Or Dr. Albert Kligman, another dick who used to do experiments on the inmates of Holmesbury prison. Same thing. What about Napoleon, huh? Definite dick. By the time he went down, there were at least 3 emperors vying for power of the world. All dicks. Dicks like you come and go, and always, always fail. Because you're not the house. The world is. You're the miserable gambler who gets himself laid out on the curb.
Fascinating. However, if your mind was expanded by thousands of years without ripping apart, and you saw what we have seen, you would likely feel the same as we.
Joseph said softly. Spare me this bullshit and just tell me what it is you want. There has to be something.
As we said, nothing.
Joseph's mask turned to view the horizon, and Lee decided to do the same.
Whatever. Might be dead soon. Better soak up the view while I can.
Though the landscape was hazy and dreary, making it hard to find any peace or tranquility, her gaze found 3 shapes coming over a sand hill.
Are those people?
As they approached, their images cleared, revealing riders on horseback. White tattoos covered the body of each. Above them, 3 birds circled and kept pace.
After 100,000 years, the Raythians come home. Word will spread. The hordes will heed the call.
Joseph sounded almost gratified. As the riders pushed their horses across the last stretch of sand, cries of triumph rose across the desert floor. Call to what? Lee felt compelled to ask, if reluctant.
To the temple, to begin anew what was forgotten.
Joseph leaned close to her.
We know you wish to leave. If you tell us where the brothers are, we will do as you like.
The second I give you what you want, I end up like Jeff, Lee said.
The man. Yes.
Joseph released her and stepped to the edge of the cliff. His cloak lifted and fell in the breeze as he awaited the arrival of his friends.
You believe we wish only harm. We are selfish, without love.
Pretty much, Lee replied.
You are wrong.
Joseph snapped back quickly, sounding greatly offended.
Our true goal is based only on love. We're sad to say there are those out there who wish pain and anguish to continue. They want innumerable creatures to suffer. Always. But soon, we will end the suffering of those we love.
You're gonna end suffering with some rocks? I thought you were becoming the Third Lord.
The brothers called us. They desire to be with us because we seek the truth. We seek their purpose. What no one has the courage to admit they desire.
The stones called you? Lee asked.
What a relief.
When they were discovered, touched by you, the brothers awoke in a new era with a new spark of life. We saw this face in our mind.
He held his gloved hand out and caressed Lee. The broken handcuff chain swung out and touched her lip.
And just as we were called here, so were you. Another piece of this puzzle.
I wasn't called here. I was hired. I'm here because of money. You know what that is, right? Lee said as if she were speaking to her spoiled 10-year-old cousin.
That is two ways of saying the same thing. You needed this. You wanted this. Your mind was engrossed by it. You would not have been here upon our arrival otherwise.
Lee was finding it hard not to squirm in his presence. You don't need me. Just call these brothers again or have them call you. I'm not part of this.
When you separated the brothers, they went silent,
Joseph said.
If you will not tell us where they've been sent, we will need to extract the information.
The riders galloped up the final stretch to meet them. There were 2 women and 1 man, dressed in patches, straps, and strands of leather hide. Now closer, their white tattoos were clear, like crescent moons and lines of geometry out of Lee's college textbook. As they slowed, one of the falcons, a beautiful brown and tan peregrine, flew in and landed on the leader's shoulder. The riders dismounted and began shouting questions at Joseph, who returned answers as they climbed the ridge. All 3 kept their eyes on Lee with contempt. The sizable, well-composed woman up front with the peregrine presented a black rock from the satchel at her side. Joseph placed his hand on it and leaned his head back with an audible gasp. After saying a few words in a strange tongue, he took his hand off the stone and gave an approving nod. The Raythian pocketed the stone, and the riders proceeded to walk their horses into camp.
More will come,
Joseph said. How are they able to find us? Lee asked.
With this.
Joseph opened his cloak and revealed the smallest black stone from the temple.
A vessel for wrath. When a Raythian is devout and true, capable of giving all and creating a vessel of their own, they will be able to hear it and follow.
As crazy as it sounded to Lee, the rock-based GPS system worked. Over the next several hours, riders arrived by the dozen, always preceded by falcons and smaller birds surveying the land. Charging hard and fast, the riders chanted as they neared, storming over the camp and taking complete control. When the sun was dropping low in the sky, headlights came over the hill. 2 all-terrain trucks approached at first, carrying more tattooed people, as well as supplies, including heaps of animal carcasses. An hour later, a 3rd truck, much larger, with an enclosed cube trailer, showed up with its own caravan of supplies. The Raythian legions poured in, always interested in or openly hateful of Lee, but seemingly unable to do anything about it so long as she was near Joseph. Nausea had settled into her gut early on from having to stand next to Jeff's killer, but at the moment, it seemed like the safest place. The riders appeared to come from every corner of the globe, representing every age group and demographic, all sharing one unique quality. They stunk to high heaven.
Why do people in cults never bathe? Or bathe way too much? Never a balance with weirdos.
At every turn, Lee found herself face to face with snarled grins, yellow teeth fighting for space in befouled mouths, and birds screeching. As the sun began setting, Joseph led her back through what was once her camp, now being torn apart for wood, fabric, and nest-building materials. That which was of no use was summarily set aflame. Joseph escorted Lee to her tent, which had already been ransacked. Even Jeff's body was gone, forcing her to imagine what may have happened, or was currently happening to it. Once she was chained to the same cot, Joseph left her, promising to return later, giving her several hours with nothing to do but think.
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should tell him what I did with the other stones. I mean, they're just rock. Yeah, but money is also just paper, and I know how people act around that shit. The stones are obviously important to these people. They're willing to kill for them. Not talking is the only thing keeping me alive. Shit.
She lay down, trying to rest while listening to the overrun camp, now a village of chaos, with physical contests and frightening tales being told over roaring fires. Pressing her jacket over her ears did nothing, and fatigue was taking its toll. Soon, her desire to give a shit waned enough to allow Lee to pass out. She woke at nighttime, not knowing if it was natural or if she had been jolted somehow, soon realizing it was not a specific sound that had woken her, but a lack of it. The once anarchic camp was silent, and an all too familiar sound was creeping up the hill. Joseph's boots and wrist chains. The tent flap opened, and the white mask swept through the doorway. He was followed by the first 3 Raythians to arrive at the site. The large, composed woman snarled at Lee, gripping a blade resembling a jagged machete.
"It's time,"
Joseph said, leaving the Raythians at the door to approach her. He loomed over Lee, a pale-faced statue in the shadows.
"We want to show you something."
He broke her chains once again and held out his gloved hand. Lee did not bother arguing, or being smart, or clever. She simply stood, refused the hand, and started towards the tent exit. Luckily, the Raythians stood aside as she passed. Once outside, she discovered why the camp had gone silent. The Raythians were gathered at the bottom of the hill, many with torches in hand, every face pointed at her tent in waiting. Even the birds on their shoulders were as quiet and still as stone. When she stepped out, there was a shudder of electricity among the crowd. Led down the hill by Joseph, she was soon surrounded by the mob, which parted as they passed. "Why do I get the feeling they want to cook and eat me?" Lee asked.
"We doubt they would take the time to cook you,"
Joseph said.
"But the Raythians can be a reasonable people, if your goals should match."
The sea of horse riders soon broke, and Joseph pressed on, leading Lee and the pack along the path to the temple. As much as she wished Jeff were here right now, she was glad he hadn't lived to see this or experience the hike that was most likely to her death. Once she entered the cave, climbed the stairs, and stepped into the temple, there would be no way out. Torchlight from the Raythian parade reflected off the orange and brown canyon walls, allowing the party to travel quickly in the dark. When the path was reduced to single file, she was pushed ahead to lead, and 20 minutes later they stepped out of the canyon to view the open gully and the cavern entrance to the temple. The Raythians grew restless as they neared the cave, a murmur of voices growing among them until it became a thunder of a dozen languages, grunts, and shrieks aimed at the sky. Spears were slapped against breastplates. The clanging metal echoed deep into the cavern as Lee entered the cave, and her continuing nightmare.
We feel you're afraid,
Joseph said quietly behind her. Wind from the birds whooshing by stirred Lee's hair as their caws overlapped. No shit, she said.
You radiate brightly for a human. We've seen much fervor in you, and your dread is palpable. You are right to be afraid. The boy has told us much about pain.
What boy? She turned to Joseph.
The body. The boy.
Joseph put his hand on his chest. Before Lee could put much thought into it, they reached the Dead Stairs cavern, where the Raythians became feral and charged past them to swarm the steps. She kept close to Joseph, trying to hold her breath. The smell was nauseating, but it was better than being swept away by the tide. Finally arriving at the base of the stairs, she wanted to pause. Anything but to go inside. But Joseph's hand on her shoulder pressed her on. Lee ascended the 11 steps and passed through the doorway, wondering if she would ever see Sky again.
Or anything at all.
Inside, the Raythians spread out in the temple like insects in a hive, carrying excited conversations in strange tongues, while others muttered crazily to themselves, running their hands along the indentations in the ground, as though it were holier than Jerusalem. The Raythian birds landed on the great statue atop the plateau, their squawking melding into a high-pitched cacophony. Joseph marched Lee to the foot of the tall stairs leading to the column plateau and the great statue of the beast, but surprisingly no desert rider dared follow. Reaching the top of the column, she moved onto the plateau with the stone baptismal bath, overlooking the crowd, their white tattoos gleaming in the torchlight. Joseph's arms opened wide over the sea below, which was beginning to chant.
You see? An army out of a rumor. The eve of mankind is weak, easily shaped.
He laughed.
To begin.
Joseph turned back to the maniacal crowd and spoke with a profound new voice, booming and fierce. She did not recognize the words, and bet many of the Raythians did not either based on their expressions, which did not seem to be the point. The energy in the room was palpably condensing. With each word spoken, the Raythians were drawn into something of a bloodlust, slithering over one another, trying to get closer to the wall, clawing at the rock, snarling and dripping saliva.
The temple of the beast is powered by wrath,
Joseph said to Lee.
As the Raythians bring more raw fury inside, the wave swells. It was here, in this spot, where the universe was forever changed.
Reaching into his pocket, Joseph revealed the smallest of the black stones, driving the crowd to utter chaos.
Pay homage to Meru,
he roared, then muttered under his breath.
Tear one another apart.
The Raythian horde collapsed into brutal insanity, clawing, chewing, and maiming, staining white tattoos red. Yet from within this, a chant grew. Bos Thiram da Sathiran! Bos Thiram da Sathiran! Bos Thiram da Sathiran! Joseph sounded gratified.
In this place, their belief in destruction as the most benevolent shade of Eve is increased 100-fold. Only with it can the stone be awakened long enough to grant us a glimpse. With its power, we will show you what we have been speaking of. though the boy thinks you'll wish we hadn't.
A multitude of desert riders held out black stones of their own, trying to catch blood from any nearby carnage.
They're ready,
Joseph said, reaching for Lee. Placing the small stone on the pedestal, he pulled away his left glove, revealing a horrid green appendage. The tissue looked dead, or close to it. Red veins, raised from the skin, spread like webs over the hand. Pus dripped from the glove and his fingertips, secreting from open sores covering his hand's palm and backside. With the exposed hand, he grabbed Lee by the throat, sending a horrid sting throughout her body.
Now you will tell me where you hid them.
With his free hand, Joseph took up the stone. Within it, the ribbons of color began going haywire. The light in Lee's mind was beginning to fade. She couldn't breathe. Joseph's smooth white mask turned on her.
It's working. Good for you,
she coughed out. He released a thunderous bellow, shaking Lee to her core.
Tell me where Melu's brothers are.
A low-pitched rumble was emitted from the stone, which quaked in his hand. Then an utter chill swept over Lee externally. Her skin, hair, eyes, everything was awash in an ice she'd never before experienced, making her feel as though she'd already died weeks ago, and the flesh was suddenly rushing to catch up, while her inner self was boiling. Life was truly empty, without a concrete world to hold on to. She was spinning. The floor dropped out within her, same as when she'd first touched the dagger, but on an astronomical scale. Lee would do anything to get away from it. She needed ground beneath her. She needed to breathe. Amid the void, a flood of information came. Lee saw the face of a teenage boy staring hatefully into a mirror. His face gave way to waves of passionate thoughts, and hateful ones. She saw the 3 black stones, and a long gestated dream involving a horrid fate for all realities.
What is all this? Why can't I stop it?
Stop, please! She was able to cough out, her eyes rolling over.
Fine, I'll talk.
A stone went to London. Institute of Archaeology. UCL. Casey knows. Stop.
A stone? You separated them yet again?
Joseph roared.
We would like to break you over and over again. Where did you send the other? Where?
The cavern her withered soul was falling through didn't end. Unbearable images were filling the void and her mind. She would have to tell him what she hadn't told anyone, where the largest stone had ended up. But before she could utter a syllable, the temple of the beast was suddenly shaken by a thunderous blast, centered on Joseph's hand, and the smallest of the black stones, forcing him to a knee. Lee was finally let go, left gasping for air, clinging to the ground.
No!
Joseph shrieked. The swirls of color in the stone were frozen in place. The electricity in the air was gone.
That can't be all. We tasted it. We need more. We need...
His frantic panic slowly subsided, and Joseph's mask drifted toward Lee.
That is all the power Melu will allow me, without his brothers.
He slumped over, his shoulders tense, holding the stone close.
No matter. We will begin by collecting raid. You will accompany us to London, where you will aid us in uniting them, or you will fade from life. This choice is not ours. It is yours.
Doesn't sound like much of a choice to me.